So good morning, everyone. My name is Mary Gertner, and both Grace and Mary Kate are scattered across campus this morning. So they've asked me to get us started. The first Sunday of every month, we gladly welcome a guest speaker to Covenant to help us hone on various topics around community concerns and social justice. And with Earth Day just being past us, we're happy to have a conversation this morning about creation. So first, I want to welcome any visitors who are here to Covenant. Thanks for joining us, as well as the folks online. We're glad to be together. And as a means for us to prepare ourselves for our hearts and minds this hour together, Mary Kate gave me a prayer that I'd like to read. Good and gracious God, we give you thanks for this new day and for an opportunity to gather together as your beloved children. We thank you especially this day for Kristen and for all that she will share with us and for the many gifts you have instilled in her. As we transition from getting here to being here, we pray that your spirit would calm whatever is chaotic within us. We pray that you would center us and that you would still the racing thoughts that fill the periphery of our inquisitive minds. Grant that we might enter into this time before us with kind and compassionate hearts. Through Christ we pray. Amen. So before I introduce Kristen, I've been given a chance to talk a little bit about our outdoor ministry, and some of you are familiar with that. But our ministry here works to provide members opportunities to experience nature, to deepen relationships with the church, each other, and our natural surroundings. We grow in faithful stewardship of the environment, and we have three focus areas or pillars that we like to call them. First is fresh air and fellowship. We've done many hikes, both locally and in the mountains. And I'll put a quick pitch in for our hike next Saturday, May the 10th. We're going to be down at the Lansford Canal State Park to see the Rocky Shoal spider lilies. If you've not done that before, it is pretty phenomenal to see. They bloom each year along the Catawba River. And so we'll take a short, we call it a hike, but it's really a walk. Anybody can do it. It's 1.5 miles out and back. It's real easy. So please consider joining us. The second pillar we have is what we call community connection. And we do earth care in sacred spaces. We have a group of people who are dedicated to keeping our columbarium area beautiful. And they also do landscaping here on campus. And we're very excited that we've got some folks who are going to continue our campus gardening, growing tomatoes, and we do stream cleans and gleaning. And the third pillar is what we call eco-theology. It's much like we're going to hear today, where we provide programming to enhance ecological and environmental knowledge with biblical, spiritual, and theology emphasis. In January, we had a 4-part series where we talked about earth care. And one of my most favorite things to do is that on both the winter and the summer solstice, we take a walk in a park. And it is the most special evening to be together, to be sharing time. And I hope you all will join us on June the 20th. So today's topic is very important to our outdoor ministry, and I'm sure to all of you who are here. So let me take a minute to introduce our guest speaker, Kristen Sommerfeld, who will lead us to continue to understand how we as Christians are called to be stewards of the earth. Kristen comes to us from Durham, North Carolina, where she is a farm manager at Interfaith Food Shuttle Farm located in Raleigh. Interfaith Food Shuttle Farm is a nonprofit whose mission is to feed neighbors, teach self-sufficiency, and grow healthy food by cultivating innovative approaches to end hunger. The farm was born out of a belief that hunger is unacceptable, and they seek to serve as a resource for anyone in need, regardless of the circumstances or belief. Prior to Kristen's time with the farm, she served as garden and gathered worship leader for Farm Church in Durham. She is also a candidate for ordination to the Ministry of Word and Sacrament in the PCUSA, having graduated from Columbia Theology Seminary in Decatur, Georgia, with a Master's of Divinity and a Master's of Arts in Practical Theology. She is at once a pastor, a theologian, a farmer, and a gardener. a wise soul, and a dear friend to all who know her. Would you please join me in welcoming Kristen?
Thank you. Thank you, Mary. Thank you guys for having me. Covenant is a place that I love. Mary Kate McAllister is one of my dearest friends, and so it is a pleasure to be here again in this capacity. So thank you again for having me. And thank you, Mary, for that lovely introduction. So today I'm going to be walking us through an understanding or perhaps revisiting how we understand the concept of dominion or the calling to have dominion over the earth, what that has meant, how it tends to manifest right now, and how it comes up particularly in my work as a produce farmer in Durham, North Carolina. So I'm going to first start with a little overview of what we're going to talk about. So we're going to talk about the roots of dominion, as I just said. Regenerative agriculture will be one of the ways I talk about how this manifests, and I'll explain what that is and give some examples of how it plays out in my day-to-day. And then finally, we'll have a moment to consider what does it mean to faithfully inhabit this domain that has been given to us, God's domain in which we are somehow called to lead. So first, a little bit about myself. How did I get here? So I started at the University of Tennessee, which I have met, where I was actually there when Jason, overlapping some time with Jason. So again, know many lovely Covenant faces. That brought me, after I was at the University of Tennessee, I did a year of service with the Presbyterian Church, with the PCUSA, through a program called the Young Adult Volunteers. In undergrad, I studied animal sciences. And so at Ferncliff is a Presbyterian camp and conference center that focuses on education around climate change. And their education farm had both livestock and produce. So I got placed there to help care for the livestock, and in turn fell in love with the produce. At that site as well, we worked with a nature preschool. We had farm camps. We had all kinds of groups. So I got to be a part of organic produce farming as a means of faith formation. And that really became the place where I realized my call to ministry. And so from there, I went to Columbia Theological Seminary, as Mary mentioned, and I went in knowing that I wanted to pursue the intersection of farming, and where those two places, we have so many stories of Jesus feeding and teaching, and using those as a means of creating connection between people, of honoring people, of bringing people together around food. And so I wanted to explore specifically that intersection, and in a way consider not only the communion table as a place where we share a meal, but kind of thinking about the soil in which the wheat was grown as the origin of the communion table. And so then, again, as Mary mentioned, after seminary, I somehow walked straight into my dream job. The exact thing that I was saying I wanted all through seminary was a church that really built itself fully integrated into this understanding that we are creatures of the earth. And so Farm Church is a small church in Durham that is a new worshiping community of the PCUSA, meets on a quarter acre outside. We would gather for worship under a magnolia tree. And the first hour of worship at Farm Church was tending the garden. We grew about 3,500 to 4,000 pounds of produce every year that we distributed for free across Durham to folks experiencing food insecurity. But that church really understood itself to be a church that is literally wrapped around a farm. And so that was a really powerful place to have my first ministry work post-seminary. And then just recently, I have transitioned to Interfaith Food Shuttle Farm. So I went from the quarter acre at Farm Church to 14 acres of integrated produce farming at Interfaith Food Shuttle. So it's been quite a journey. But along this transition, my training at University of Tennessee was very much in an industrial, for-profit agricultural system. And while I would not say there's anything inherently wrong with needing to make a living off of what we're doing in agriculture. Certainly not. But when we get to certain scales, things can get a little bit out of balance. And so this transition from the University of Tennessee to where I am now has really been a transition towards regenerative nonprofit agriculture. And this is part of where I now find that really deep sense of faithful inhabitants as a part of the necessity to grow so that we have food not just for ourselves, but for everyone in a way that dignifies people and land and all creatures. So this is the Interfaith Food Shuttle Farm. This is just the top. 14 acres is obviously a bit hard to get in one photo, but it gives you an idea of kind of the scale we're working on now. The Food Shuttle Farm has multiple high tunnels. We have multiple greenhouses. We have about 6 to 8 acres in produce production at any one time. And then we have an irrigation pond. We have a berry field. So it's much larger scale. So going from, again, working for an hour on Sunday morning with 20 to 30 congregants, and that being pretty much all we needed to get our harvest done for the week, to now 3 tractors, 5 staff, over 100 volunteers a week, and we are going as fast as we can to keep up. And so one of the things that has remained central through these transitions is an understanding that I have come to that food is certainly a place that we experience our culture. It's a place where we find tradition and rhythm within our families, but we can culture. But food is a place in which we receive and stand in. We find dignity and honor in our food. And so at the Food Shuttle and in all places in which we are farming for the sake of giving food, getting foods into the hands of people who are experiencing food insecurity, it is about nutrition. It is about reallocating resources in a more equitable way, but it is also about giving dignity and giving honor to those who have been marginalized, to those who have been oppressed, and trying to preserve that in and through food. So one of the things that's very important to us is everything that's harvested, we want it to be farmers market quality. We don't want anything to be perceived as a leftover, because that is where autonomy and dignity, come into play the most. So we'll revisit the idea of dominion. So dominion comes from Genesis 1, verse 26. And so I have a couple of different translations here. So in the KJV, which was originally published in 1611, Genesis 1:26 says, "And God said, let us make man in our image after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the fowl of the air, over the cattle, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creepeth upon the earth." And so then a little over 300 years later, we have the Revised Standard Version, which is the predecessor to the NRSV, which I would imagine is a common one for covenant. And so this one says, "Then God said, let us make humans in our image according to our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea." So we have no change there. Let them have dominion over in both the KJV and the RSV. Then the NIV comes another 25-ish. And we move from "let them have dominion over" to let us make them in our image and in our likeness, so that they may rule over the fish in the sea, etc. And then the most recent, 1982, this is the Message, says, "Let us make them in our image so that they can be responsible for." So would guess many of us have been familiar with slightly different language used for this concept of dominion. But it's interesting to me to track this slow progression. We can see here some bit of progression in our understanding towards a more equitable, perhaps gentler approach. But what is clear to me is that through all of these, we are called to leadership in some capacity. So the original word, dominion, comes from the Hebrew word redu, which is the conjugated form of the verb rada, which means to rule. So there is definitely some understanding of leadership, but also power. And so again, we've had different translations, and I think we've probably all encountered in some capacity this evolving understanding of what it means to rule over the earth specifically. Dominion also comes up in one particular political place. The Balfour Declaration of 1926 was in Britain. This is when Britain decided to call the other countries for which they had dominion, places like Canada, Australia, any of what we would now call countries in the Commonwealth. They used the term dominion. And so Britain coins those territories as dominions that are autonomous communities within the British Empire, equal in status and in no way subordinate to another in any aspect of their domestic or external affairs. So this is actually a case in which dominion is used to try to give more autonomy to subjugated groups. But even so, the challenge here is that even if you are trying to give more autonomy, they are still under the control of Britain. So this one's kind of gray, but this is a really interesting, this to me is a really clear instance in which we see how dominion has been tied up in colonization and in some instances been used as an excuse for exploitation. And so it gets really tricky. So again, whereas these top couple of photos might have been what I would imagine pre-industrial agriculture, very mixed media. Your rows, every row might have something different. There's a lot more weeds in some of this, like we have more hand cultivated. But predominantly you just see a vaster array of nature being nature. Nature is not uniform. Anytime we are outside, you will notice on any of these walks with the outdoor ministry that there is a vast amount of diversity in nature. And so when it comes to agriculture specifically, industrialized agriculture, anything post-industrial revolution, it's not hard to see how it has become, like dominion has had this understanding, has influenced how we've gotten to these lower pictures, which are incredibly uniform. You can see this exhorting power and ruling over the earth in a way that kind of gets the earth in line with our priorities rather than the other way around, or rather than any kind of middle ground. And so this is tricky. Again, as populations exploded, we needed to find ways to make more food. The challenge is the speed and the aggression with which we continue to do that. Especially now, we know we're producing far more food than the whole world needs, but 40% of it goes to waste. So the problem is not producing enough. It is producing it in a way that is sustainable and can get to everyone who needs it. So then we also have examples of dominion like this. So I get my natural gas at my house from a company called Dominion Energy, which just united with Enbridge. And so again, there's this just interesting to me, dominion as the word that is used for an energy company that is putting in pipelines to move natural gas across our country. There's some irony there. Or perhaps not. Perhaps it's just a clear point of how we've come to understand dominion, or come to normalize dominion as something that gives us reason to do whatever we want, free of any consequence. And so the question to me sometimes, as I mentioned, is, do we actually need to find new language, or do we need to adjust our understanding? And I think it's always both. New language is helpful for reflecting those new understandings. But again, the ultimate kernel here is that we are called to lead this domain. We have been given leadership in God's created, this earthly domain that God has created and entrusted to us. But even in our day-to-day, in our workplace, we know you have a lot of options. When you are a manager, when you are a leader of any kind, your upper management probably is not going to dictate exactly how you posture yourself towards your team. But we also know that how you posture yourself towards your team has consequences, not because anyone is punishing you, but simply because how we choose to lead has a simple cause and effect. And so this plays out a little bit this is an aerial view of the Interfaith Food Shuttle farm. So you can see some of the cultivated fields, and it gives you a big understanding. But before we were on this property, we started in 2008 on this piece of land, and we had tobacco before that, and we're not previous to the tobacco farm, we're not entirely sure. And so one of the challenges in having a farm that was previously monocropped means that our soils are pretty well depleted. When you have one crop all the time, that's pulling the same nutrients every single crop. So your soil gets depleted in the same way every time, and that has a degrading effect. So there are lots of ways that we can choose alternatives and recover from that. But part of what I have inherited on this farm are the consequences of generations of monocropping. And so we have a lot of pest pressure, we have a lot of disease pressure, and that comes because our soils are not very diverse. We know in all of our spaces, again, that diversity makes us stronger. It literally makes our soil stronger. It makes your plants more resilient. It brings an ecosystem back into order. We need diversity in the soil. So I'm going to nerd out for a little bit about soil now. And so what I'm going to be talking about in this next little bit, I'm going to give some examples. Again, this farm that I inherited had been using organic practices. Organic agriculture, what that means, it doesn't mean you spray nothing. This is one of the most common misconceptions. Organic does not mean you don't apply anything. It just means that what you apply is chemically organic, as in it contains carbon. So there are still many pesticides, many herbicides that are organic. It does mean they're slightly less, have slightly less impact. Doesn't mean they're biodegradable, but they have slightly less impact on the soil. But it's still coming from a chemistry perspective. Regenerative agriculture, on the other hand, is coming from a biology perspective. So one of the ways this shifts, farmers often get, and I know we have lots of people who have farming backgrounds, we get soil tests done twice a year, November 1st and April 1st. That's your standard, go get your soil tests and send them to the NCDA. When you get a standard soil test, what we've been doing for years, you get a chemical profile back. You have this much of this, you have this much magnesium, this much potassium, this much nitrogen. How much of each chemical, how much of each nutrient do you have available in the soil? It doesn't say anything about how much oxygen is being exchanged. It doesn't say anything about what microbes are present. It helps us know if the vitamins and minerals that the plants need are present. There are also lots of instances in which you might have tons of magnesium. This is happening on my farm right now. We have tons of magnesium in our soil. But when we planted peas, they started showing magnesium deficiency. We're like, well, that's weird. We know there's lots of magnesium in the soil, but we also have tons of zinc and phosphorus. So this is kind of like a calcium vitamin D thing. Like if you're taking calcium, you also need to take vitamin D, or maybe it's the other way around. I don't know if we have any medical professionals, but I know that you have to have them both in our vitamins. It's a similar thing in the soil. If you have too much magnesium, it can bind up, or if you have too much zinc, it can bind up the magnesium. So it's present in the soil, but it's not plant available. So that's kind of a chemical approach. Regenerative agriculture is asking how much life is happening in the soil. What fungi are present? What bacteria are present? How much are they respirating? Not just are they there, but are they alive? And that actually gives us a much better indicator of how much diversity we have, how much we're able to utilize those things. So here's another example, the case of the ladybugs. This is one of the high tunnels at the farm. We're growing cherry tomatoes in here this year. So cherry tomatoes are in the ground. At the time that this happens, it didn't quite look like this yet. This is just the other day. But we had the rows built. We had a clover cover crop in over the winter that fixes nitrogen. So we came in, we started looking at the clover, and we started to see on some of these leaves some aphids. So on first leaf, we're like, oh no, we don't want those. Then we see the second leaf, like, oh, that's not good. And then we saw this one. And so again, aphids. Aphids have become resistant to pesticides. They're chemically resistant because when you use the same chemical, these are living creatures. They build a tolerance to it. There are no pesticides that will kill aphids anymore. So what we're left with is biology. Ladybugs are the best natural predator for aphids. So then the question became, how do we attract ladybugs? We kept looking. We found a ladybug in the greenhouse. And so we thought, oh, thank goodness. Okay, how do we make her happy? And how do we get more of her? Then we saw this guy. This, when we first looked at it, we thought was a Colorado potato beetle. Those are big bad, capital B, big bad. They will decimate your crops. Aphids, problem, have a natural predator. Colorado potato beetles they're not resistant to everything, but they have much more like decimating power than aphids. So this became a real problem. Luckily we decided to go home over the weekend, not panic, go home and think on it. And then over the course of the weekend, okay, well, before I get into what the solution was, I'm gonna dangle the carrot a little bit longer. So the question becomes, do we spray with an organic pesticide or do we try to find a biological solution? Now, this got back to 9th grade biology a little bit. This is a cross section of a plant root. So you see in the center, we have the root coming down. You can see a bacterial node. The AMF are mycorrhizal fungi. I forget what the A is, but it's mycorrhizal fungi. So those are our fungal friends who are intermingling with the mycelia of mushrooms nearby. AMF are incredibly powerful. They're our like stockbrokers of the roots. They attach to roots. The plant feeds them carbohydrates. And then the AMF actually store them up and they barter with the nutrients in the soil to say, hey, this plant's telling me it needs some zinc. I'll trade you this many carbohydrates for that nutrient. So they attach themselves to the roots and the root hairs, and they do that trading for the plant. So the rhizosphere is that space within the box. That is the area around a plant root in which biology is happening. That's where things are changing. So that's why, like, we think about, like, when you water a plant, you want to get it near the roots. It needs to get into the rhizosphere for it to be able to be taken up. But the rhizosphere, again, that's where our good bacteria are, all those bacterial nodes, the fungi. And if we were to spray, sprays do not just stay on the leaves and get the pests. They infiltrate into the soil and they would damage this rhizosphere. So we know that if we were to spray, the question we now have is, how do we weigh the balance of this pest that could potentially decimate our crop, or us getting rid of that pest and decimating the bacteria or the biology in the soil? Like, how do you make that choice? It's not an easy one. And so that's one of the things with this. It's very unclear. This is a very gray space to live in. So these are some of the specific effects of pesticide residues in the soil on the rhizosphere. Disruption of the microbial structure is that exact thing. You probably will kill your good bacteria. Same thing that taking antibiotics can be really harmful for your gut. Kills the good bacteria too. Disruption of the plant microbe interactions. That's the AMF doing that trading for you. That gets wampus if you have pesticides in there kind of breaking them down. Potential for resistances. Lots of bugs lay their eggs in the soil over the winter. So if they're in there, they have all winter to get to know these pesticide residues. Next year, what they hatch out might be resistant to them. Damage to the plant metabolism. So you can actually stunt your plants by having had sprayed. The peas that we had the magnesium problem with. When they were in our greenhouse, they had a really bad fungal infection. And in a greenhouse, that becomes really critical because you have a humid environment, you have fans. It can spread to everything. So earlier in the season, we did spray the peas with copper. Copper is obviously a metal. It is an organic amendment. It's an organic chemical, but it's harsh. And we watched those go in the ground. They had a magnesium deficiency, and they're continuing to be incredibly behind on their growth rates. So we know that pesticide in those tiny cells totally probably saturated all the soil that was right around them and affected their plant metabolism. The inhibition of nitrogen fixation. This is a real problem when you're thinking about cover crops. Nitrogen is one of the biggest, most important nutrients in the soil that plants, especially fruiting plants, vegetables, need in order to create that beautiful dark green. Collard greens are a nitrogen leaf. So if we inhibit that process, that's one of the biggest tools in our tool chest for regenerating soils after we have taken a bunch of nutrients out into our tomatoes and created whatever product we need. If we don't have a way to replenish that, we're going to be on that train of soil degradation. And then last, the altering of root exudates. That exudates are part of, again, that AMF, like they secrete certain things to let the soil know what it needs. So we have a lot of different effects of if we are choosing the pesticide option. It's a weighty one. So we come back to this guy, and all weekend, I'm like waking up in the middle of the night, being like, what are we gonna do? What are we gonna do? And like pulling the phone up, pulling the picture up on my phone, just staring, like, could it be anything else than this guy? Like that looks really similar. And so I'm Googling around. This is a ladybug pupa. Do you see the spots on the center of the back? That was the biggest relief of the season thus far. That's not a Colorado potato beetle. That's a ladybug pupa. We had seen lots of ladybug larvae and identified it immediately. But we saw this orange guy, and our anxiety went, oh, potato beetle, because we know those are capital B, big bad. So once we notice those tiny spots down the center, we like, oh, we don't have to spray. It's more ladybugs in the making. And so if we had followed that panic reaction and sprayed, we would have just killed the ladybugs who had the potential and within 2 weeks ate all the aphids. Again, knowing that tomatoes were going to go in that greenhouse, aphids love tomatoes. So we were especially concerned that we needed to solve this problem before tomatoes got in the ground. So what we know here is that when soil biology, when the diversity of our soils increase, we see a direct increase in nutrient density of the plants themselves. When you have a more diverse, more resilient soil, your plants are more diverse, more resilient. They have a better foundation. They're able to uptake more nutrients and hold that in the fruit. Again, more microbial diversity. This, again, creates stronger, more resilient plants, which will lead to higher pest and disease resistance. If you have a strong foundation, if you have a healthy gut microbiome, you're a lot less likely to get a common cold. It's the same thing in plants. If you have a strong microbial foundation in the soil, you're much less likely to deal with some of the most common pests and disease because you have an ecosystem that is fostering the land in balance. Even though we as farmers are absolutely there with a clear intent. It's not that I am coming with a beautiful kumbaya, I want nothing from you land. I want yield. I need production. Whether it's, in my case, I'm not selling produce, I don't need it to actually make my income. But our goal at the Food Shuttle is to get nutritious food into the hands of people in our community. So growing as much as possible is still a priority. So this becomes incredibly tricky. So my point, when we're talking about what it means to faithfully inhabit God's earthly domain, is not that it's easy or clear cut. Sometimes we do choose an organic chemical approach that has consequences, but then we are left to pick up those consequences next season. And so that's what I want to invite us into when we're thinking about what it means to have dominion over the earth, whether we want to choose new language, to be stewards of the earth, to have responsibility for the earth, or even if we hold on to the word dominion, understanding that, yeah, we do have power and leadership and a lot of autonomy over what happens in this created realm. But how we choose to posture ourselves will bring consequences that we are then responsible for as well. So again, this is incredibly murky space. It's really hard because ultimately what it comes down to for me and my team every day is how long can we resist that panic response? When we see a threat to our product, how long can we stave off the reactive posture to sit down together and think, what are the natural solutions to this? What natural predators do we already have? What companion plants can we bring in? What, could we draw in bats to eat the mosquitoes? Could we draw in other types of natural predators? Or another way we think about this again with cover crops, what kind of cover crop does this mean if we can't fix it right now? If we have to choose the chemical approach in order to have produce, what are we putting on the docket to counteract that which we asked from the land? How are we going to give back to it to rehabilitate that thing that we took from it in deciding to choose our crop over the dignity of the soil? So sometimes that means we plant a specific kind of cover crop. We add a certain kind of amendment. We add a little bit extra compost. So it's really murky. And especially when you are in the process of transitioning and trying to build that health back, it's certainly not a 1 year. This is a many year process. So yeah, all that to say is it's very unclear. I'm not here to say that you need to pick a new, very firm opinion. But this is a murky space that requires faithfulness in the sense of constant engagement, constant attention to not just what agriculture practices that each of you theoretically support, but when we are shopping for groceries, where are we shopping for them? Having conversations with, especially at farmers markets, you can talk to the people and ask them, what kind of practices do you use? Do you use organic practices? Do you use regenerative practices? And most likely, they'll have a kind of convoluted, complicated answer because they're also in the business of trying to weigh all these different variables in order to have a successful crop and to ensure that they can have a successful crop for many years to come. It's not only about dignity for the earth. It's all some of it is selfishness and making sure that in 10 years, this farm has soil that can still produce vegetables. So the question is, what will we prioritize? As inhabitants of God's creation, we know that we're called to lead, but what is it that we choose to prioritize? Both in, yes, the things that you might advocate for on the local, federal, any sort of level, but what are you choosing to prioritize in the small area of your household domain in what you are supporting with your dollar at the grocery store, at the farmer's market, and potentially in your backyards? I imagine some of you might have boxes in your backyards as well. So I think that's about it. I did not ask at the beginning for y'all to prep questions, but I have a bit of time to answer some if you do have some.
Would you please join me in thanking Kristen? We do have a little bit of time for some question and response. So I have a few things to respond with and a question for you. And as Kristen responds to that question in just a moment, I'll be glad to collect any questions that you have and to offer those up. The first thing that came to mind for me, you said, talk to the people at the farmer's market. There's a great farmer's market just down the street on Kings Drive. I'm going to feel so smart if I get up to the checkout at Kings Drive Farmer's Market and ask them about their organic versus regenerative farming practices. So I'll let y'all know how that goes.
Ask them about their root exudates and see what
I'll need to write that down to make sure I get it right. But in hearing you speak, there are a lot of parallels to the life of faith. And some of you might have participated in a Lenten life group, and I participated in one myself. And a conversation that I had with my life group came to mind. We were talking about the parable of the sower, and we were talking about the soil that we felt we were in, and whether or not we were getting the nutrients that we needed from the soil that we were in. And that conversation stuck with me so much. And I remember one participant saying, I think I need to be repotted. And, we've probably all felt that way at some point, that we need to be repotted. And we're going to pause for just a moment. We have probably all had these times in our lives where we feel like we need to be repotted, and it's probably when we find ourselves in soil that's not diverse enough. So I love that parallel, and I love thinking about it so specifically of how it relates to real life soil. A question that came up for me when you were speaking is, and we've spoken about this a little bit before, you are so entrenched in how seasons affect the land and what the land needs based on the time of year that it is. I wonder if you could speak a little bit about what you have learned and how being so close to the seasons and the land's response to the season, how that impacts your own spiritual life. What have you learned about your own needs as a spiritual being and as a created creature of God? How do we learn from the land in terms of how we are to respond to the different seasons?
Yeah, thank you. That's a
And I'll
great
collect
question.
questions as Kristen.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yes. So seasonality is a huge part of farming, obviously, and has very much had an impact on my own day to day. Again, this comes up a lot. One of the ways I love to feel more connected to the seasonality of the space that I'm in is through seasonal eating. Shopping at the farmers market is one of the easiest ways to do that. It forces you to become really aware of what is being produced this season. And what you notice really quickly is that not everything is produced all the time. Certain seasons, almost nothing is produced. And so that has become for me something that is really a frustrating lesson to learn, but is one that I am continually learning and learning from the earth. That yes, sometimes we need to be repotted. Sometimes you might be in a season, or I might be in a season, and it's not just okay, it is divinely created that there are seasons in which we need a cover crop, and we are just covered up and curled inside, and we are working on replenishing. That is, for me, has always been one of the hardest ones. I'm someone who finds a lot of value in what I can produce. And we know from our life of faith that one of the beauties of being a person of faith is that in Christ, that is literally not the point. We don't have to produce. We are freed from that need. But that's a hard one for me to learn. And so in working with the soil and with land that is changing all the time, that has been, I think, one of the most helpful things to receive from creation is that blessing, not just to rest, but to like actively replenish. And that in other seasons, it is joyous and good to be very productive. But that in those productive seasons, productivity looks different and it feels different. And all like there is a place for all of those things. Both in our faith journey and in our lives, that these seasons, again, are not just normal. They are divinely created. It is not intended to be production all the time or rest all the time. It is intended to be something that ebbs and flows. And so that is, I continue to receive that from creation as the more and more I spend time with it.
Thank you. I think that's a good reminder for all of us. All right, a few questions. Some of these are just practical.
Okay.
How do you distribute the food to the
Mhm.
people who need it?
That's a great question. So Interfaith Food Shuttle has a variety of programs in our feed umbrella. When Interfaith Food Shuttle started, it started in 1989 with two friends. One was Jewish and one was Christian. That's where the name Interfaith Food Shuttle came from. They started noticing at their kids' schools and at any sort of gatherings or practices, there was often extra food that often just got thrown away. So they stepped into that gap to what we call recover and then distribute that food to food pantries and to individuals who could eat that food that's perfectly safe, perfectly healthy, but the machine of food service didn't have a use for it anymore, so it was going to go into the trash. So that's where we started, and that remains the biggest kind of anchor, the core of Interfaith Food Shuttle. Now we recover and distribute over 1 million pounds of food across 7 counties in central North Carolina. So we have a fleet of refrigerated trucks. We have 2 warehouses. So it has blossomed into being a full-scale food bank. We purchase food from local farms. We get produce from the Interfaith Food Shuttle farm. We also have a culinary department. That's our teach arm. So we have a culinary education and training program that's 12 weeks. And that program runs a mobile food truck and a catering company, and also makes meals for Meals on Wheels. So that's some of the food that we receive is prepared and goes out directly to people's homes, prepared means. Again, the lion's share is coming in. We have partners at farms, at grocery stores, all sorts of markets. We have drivers that pick up the food, bring it back to the warehouse, volunteers who help sort it. If you've ever worked at a food bank, you might have helped sort food. And then that food goes to food pantries, predominantly to food pantries. We do have a grocery bags for seniors program. We have backpack buddies program. So similar, some of it is going directly to people's doors. But on the farm side, it gets picked up twice a week and taken to the warehouse and then redistributed. And we have an order system with culinary too to decide what they can use. Our goal is that in every dish, eventually there will be some produce from the Interfaith Food Shuttle farm. So that's a bit of a big overview, but it's all just kind of or picked up, centralized, shuffled, and then redistributed.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So you mentioned volunteers. Who are the volunteers that you work with? So what kind of folks volunteer to work, and how frequently, and do they ever receive any of the harvest?
That's a great question. We have, I'll speak to the farm, well, primarily. We have a huge network of volunteers at the Food Shuttle as a whole. We use an online software, and folks can sign up on a calendar. You can volunteer in a number of different departments, delivering produce to seniors, preparing meals for Meals on Wheels, sorting produce, working front desk, riding with drivers to help deliver. And then at the farm, we have shifts 3 days a week, Monday, Wednesday, Friday, 8 to 11 a.m. to help avoid the heat as much as possible. And those volunteer groups, we have individuals who sign up on their own or with their friends. We also invite individuals who have court-ordered community service to come and work with us on the farm. We work with corporate groups who have a volunteer day at work. So we have a lot of different teams come in. And then we also have a group that we call core volunteers. So these are volunteers who have been with us for years, and they help us lead our crew teams. And so our crews do everything except the heavy machinery operation at the farm. They help us plant, they help us seed things in the greenhouse, they help us harvest. We also have a post-harvest packing operation at the farm. We have a barn where things are inspected, boxed, weighed, and ready to ship out. And so we have volunteers in that as well. And we also have volunteers who help us with our sanitation. We have food safety on the farm, starts in the field and goes all the way through the distribution. So there's a lot of sanitation that happens. So we have volunteers throughout, and it is everyone you can think of. Our minimum age is 13, but we have youth groups, we have church groups, we have work groups, we have just Abby who had a free morning. So it's really everybody, and it's a good time.
That's great. So it's obviously very dependent on volunteers. You need the volunteers. How are y'all funded?
Yeah, we are funded predominantly through grants, and we do have individual donors and some corporate donors as well. One of the beautiful things is that we have a development team at the Interfaith Food Shuttle, which has been a huge joy to me to get to work with a development team and not have that be one of the things I'm doing as well. So predominantly grants, and then also mostly corporate sponsorships for events and individual donors. And then one of the things this is very small, but I didn't mention in the food distribution and the volunteers getting some food, when we also have a small farm stand on the farm. We have an original tobacco barn that we've turned into a farm stand that we sell up to 3% of our food in that space for a very affordable price for our volunteers to be able to take some home. For anyone in the community, we have a neighborhood right across the street. Everything around us is residential. So for folks to be able to come get some local produce, and that is not intended to be enough revenue to offset the entire cost of running a farm this size, like not by any means. But it is a place in which we are able to interact with our community. We do find some donors that way. And it does support us, but it's also a way of us participating in a smaller, slower, more local food system. So wide array of funding sources.
Thank you. So I'm sure it was shared with folks that that we were seminary classmates and you are a candidate for ordination in the PCUSA. This is a little bit more related to the church side of things. Does the PCUSA have a curriculum for adults or children regarding care for the earth? And if not, how can we advocate for one? And or do you know of resources, or would you recommend any particular resources for that kind of thing?
Yes, this is another great question. And off the top of my head, I know, so in the Presbyterian Church, there is something called Earth Care congregations. And so that is something that the outdoor ministry could certainly investigate. The Earth Care congregations is a pretty robust program. In order to become an Earth Care congregation, there is a process of looking at all parts of the operations of a congregation, from what kind of coffee cups do you use to what kind of, are you using disposable or reusable plates when you have a meal, all those sorts of things. And what's your landscaping like? What's your theology like? What's your church curriculum like? And so that invites churches into a smaller community of really creation-minded communities. And I know there are resources through there. Off the top of my head, I don't know any official Earth Care curriculums. I know there are a number of resources online, and the PCUSA, the Presbyterian women did a study on Earth Care, I believe this fall. It was recent. So there's a number of resources. They are a little bit dispersed, but they are there. But Earth Care congregations would be my number one avenue to pursue.
So something to keep working towards. There's still some things out there though.
Yeah.
All right, this might be our last question. This is another kind of practical one. We must have a farmer or gardener in the room. Is there a companion plant for your tomatoes?
There is.
And could you explain, perhaps, for those of us who are really not farmers and gardeners?
So companion plants are plants that like to grow together. So all plants have companions. Some are, for tomatoes, there are actually some particular, so basil is actually one of the best companions for tomatoes. They taste well together and they grow well together. And marigolds are also a nearly universal companion. Marigolds attract beneficial pollinators, and they also repel things like bunnies. But marigolds have, not to my nose at least, but they do have a fairly strong scent that help repel pests and bunnies. They're like something as big as a deer's probably not going to work for them, but they can help with bunnies. So in raised beds or at my house, I will plant literally like a perimeter of marigolds around the box so that the bunnies, they might, if they're really, really determined, or if you have a groundhog, that's a hard one. But sometimes they will just plow through them, but it's a good start and it will attract ladybugs, butterflies. So having companions in marigolds and basil specifically for your tomatoes. And basil also, one of the ways that this is a companion is that basil, if you put it at the base of your tomatoes, it's going to be slightly shaded by the tomatoes because it's smaller. And so in the heat of the summer, basil doesn't want the full heat. So when it's in the shade of the tomato, it's actually going to be able to grow longer throughout the season before it puts out seeds. If anybody's ever grown basil, it will do what we call bolt and send up seeds because the plant is receiving the heat and saying, this is too hot. I'm going to die. I need to put out seeds so that my progeny can stay. And so in order to keep it putting out leaves, you trim off that seed head. But when it's in the shade of a tomato plant, it's going to do that slower. Because as soon as the plant goes, oh no, preserve myself, it stops putting out leaves. And when you want the leaves, you got to keep telling the plant like, no, you're good. I'm caring for you. I want your leaves. So basil is a great one for tomatoes, but marigolds are almost universal. So that's a very practical one. But you can also, I will say, this is one place in which the internet is actually pretty reliable. Companion plants specifically. Don't go too crazy with like gardening ideas from the internet, but companion plants, I do a lot of that in the field. Are these two specific things companions? And sometimes like most of what you need to look for is if they're actually like definitely not companions. Peas and garlic or onions are one that you do not want to plant together because they can stunt each other. So there are interactions, but Google you're pretty safe if you want to say like, what's a good companion for this plant in my garden? That's always a pretty trustworthy resource in this arena.
Thank you.
Of course.
Well, Kristen is one of my companion plants. I'm selfishly just so grateful that we got to have you come and speak, and that you all got to learn from her wisdom and expertise. So once again, would you join me in thanking Kristen for being here? I would imagine you're willing to stick around for just a few minutes if there are other
Absolutely.
questions. And in just a second early, there's a congregational meeting over in the sanctuary at 10:30 where the associate pastor nominating committee will be presenting a candidate. So if you are interested in attending that congregational meeting, I would encourage you to make your way there. There will be worship across the way at 11 o'clock, and then our family service here at 11 o'clock as well. So thank you all so much for being here. Thank you, Kristen.
Thanks for
And
having
go
me.
in peace.